Good morning.
Morning.
Morning. Again, this is Panorama Plus 6. We are in session 5, the story of Solomon, the third and final king of the United Empire. I find it strange that of the 41 kings listed in the sacred text, only 3 were of a united empire. Because with the death of Solomon, and because of some bad decisions that he made, which we will see today, it paved the way for a split in the kingdom. There had always had been tribal jealousies between the North and the South, much like what we experienced in our culture. But these became very, very clear and delineated with the death of Solomon and some of the rash actions of his son Rehoboam. So we'll be seeing that. 1 Corinthians chapter 10 is a reminder. The Apostle Paul is, in Corinthians, addressing a number of problems. You know that because he'll say something like, now concerning such and so, and then he'll give a little bit of exposition about it. And in 1 Corinthians 10, he appeals to what we call the Old Testament or the Hebrew Scriptures. And he says, he uses the Israelites and their bondage in Egypt as an example. But then in verse 6, he says this, now these things, talking about Old Testament stories, these things occurred as examples to keep us from setting our hearts on evil things as they did. And then he goes down in verse 11. Now these things happen as examples and were written down as warnings for us. So not centering on the specific examples he was looking at, there's a general principle there. And that principle is this, is the Old Testament is not just a history to be cataloged and not referred to, but the things that happen to the Old Testament characters or the things that happen to the nation of Israel and the Israelites, those are examples for us. Sometimes they encourage us. Quite often, as Paul says here, they warn us. So when we come to the lives of 3 kings, none of us here will ever be kings. But nonetheless, these kings whose lives were to be exemplary and closely related to God, they were to follow God in covenant loyalty, and that they were serving under God's leadership. That's why we call them theo-monarchs. God was ruling the monarch, who then would rule the people on behalf of the ultimate King of Kings. And so consequently, their lives can become patterns, things to either embrace or things that would warn us. And I think the central theme that you've probably picked up on by now is, where is the king's heart? Because that's the central question for all of us. Where's your heart? Is your heart fully devoted to the Lord, or is your heart wayward, and so forth? And so we have seen Saul, he lost his heart for God. David misplaced his heart, but he later regained it. So he still had some consequences of his failures, but later he regained it. Now we come to Solomon, and Solomon is going to share his heart for God. Part of that's going to be the result of some unwise political marriages. Part of that's just going to be because of Solomon's basic nature, which we'll see in the text. But nonetheless, Solomon is the example of the one who wants to be devoted to God, but he also wants to be devoted to the gods that his wives bring in. And so we call that syncretic. It's a blending of gods into one way of worship. And so therefore we say he shared his heart. God is very clear in the 10 Commandments. You'll have no other gods before me. And so Solomon will be guilty of breaking a couple of the fundamental Ten Commandments, worshiping an idol, sharing his heart, and acknowledging other gods. All right, we're on page 109. And as we do in the accordion method, we always want to remind ourselves of breadth before we go to depth. And sometimes we go back to breadth. That's why those charts are so endearing to all of us, so endearing to me. You'll notice on the page 109, we have the 6 movements we've covered thus far in Panorama Plus. We are in the movement 6, the United Monarchy. We have the biblical books there, but then let's review, just to remind ourselves again, if we are doing the Panorama timeline. Panorama timeline starts off with the prologue, creation, fall, flood, tower, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph. We throw Job in there because he lived around that period of time. That's the Panorama timeline, and it would be well worth, if you're a serious student of Scripture, it'd be well worth your time to try to commit to memory some sense of the biblical chronological flow of key people, places, and events that hold together the biblical narrative. For movement 6, we start with Eli, who will mentor young Samuel. They are the last of the judges. Samuel becomes the transition figure to the days of the kingship. And those 3 kings are Saul, David, Solomon. And this movement ends in 931 BC. That's the date of the death of Solomon. So it's a pretty simple timeline, focusing on those 3 kings. On the next page, you see the key personalities. This is a familiar chart. At the bottom, we now highlight Solomon, who also, of course, is from the tribe of Judah. And then I've given a little quick biblical review of the charting of 1 Samuel. Breaks down into 3 movements. We covered the first 7 chapters. That's basically session 1. We look at Eli and Samuel. Then session 2 is chapters 8 to 15. Also, 16 to 31 is sessions 2 and 3. There's a little bit of overlap there. If you'll turn the page, we have the biography of King David. And we look at it in the sense of King David looking good, King David looking bad. And what's the pivot? What's the turning point in King David's life? Well, it's the affair with Bathsheba. And we've taken a look at that. That's session 1 to 10 is session 3. 11 to 24 is session 4 primarily. And we also cover the Davidic Covenant and so forth. Now we have come to, in the middle of the page, 1 Kings. And 1 Kings, if you're trying to get the accordion broad arms around this biblical book, it has 2 movements, real simple. 1 to 11 is the story of Solomon, the last of the kings. Then beginning with 12 through 22, we're going to have a divided kingdom. Israel's the kingdom in the north. Judah is the kingdom in the south. And so we'll see that. Now, in those distinctive features I've given you, only the first 3 are covered in 1 Kings 1 through 11. We'll see Solomon's prominence expressed in his wisdom, his buildings, the splendor of his kingdom. We'll see the construction of the temple. We'll also see the construction of the tabernacle. The palace. He will build a magnificent temple. They call it that it was Solomonic glory in the building of his temple. And then the scripture will describe the building of his palace. Which one do you think was bigger? Okay, well, we'll see in a minute, but you've probably already got a sense, which might give us an insight into what was really more important to him. Because his palace had to also include a palace within the palace for his wife of Pharaoh. That was a political alliance. And then also we'll see his grievous failures. The most serious failure is that he lost his heart or shared his heart for God. We're going to see in 1st and 2nd Kings, we'll do 2nd Kings into 1 Kings and all of 2 Kings in movement number 7. But what we're going to see is Solomon's from Solomon's kingship through the end of the divided monarchy will cover almost 400 years. So 1 Kings and 2 Kings is about 400 years of biblical history. Now, let's turn the page to 112 and let's get started on Solomon's life. He is the third and last king. He is continuing as the son of David. Solomon is continuing the Davidic dynasty, and he will face basically 7 major challenges. And in order to kind of capsule that, I felt like we needed something. And so what we need is a chart, and it's on the next page. So look at page 113. And we do need to look at this chart. It's important in understanding his life. First of all, there's a column for the challenge that Solomon had to face. Then there is either an antagonist or an issue that he's facing. And then there's the outcome. What happened? Well, here's his first major challenge. He's got to succeed his father as king. David has more than one son. Some of his sons have died. In fact, the first 3 sons have already died. Solomon is not next in line by age. And so that's his first challenge. We will find that his antagonist will be his brother or half-brother Adonijah, who is David's 4th and eldest living son. So by culture of the day, Adonijah would have been the cultural choice, the expected choice of the next king. But God, as well as King David in this case, don't always follow custom. And so the approved son will be Solomon, but that's not going to go well with Adonijah. He has his heart set on the throne. The outcome is Solomon will be appointed by David. Second challenge, there was a conspiracy to remove him as king. Adonijah is going to make a play for the throne. And he's going to, there's several other key characters. We'll get it in the story. But in this play for the throne, all of these conspirators will be put to death. And we'll see that as it happens in the text. Third challenge, just reigning as the king. Here you are, a son of David, but are you really prepared to rule, to be the king? And so his issue then is he needs wisdom to rule, right? And so God is going to grant him his request for wisdom. This is probably the high point, or at least one of the high points of Solomon's life, is that he's wise enough to acknowledge that he needs more wisdom. At least he's got enough wisdom to ask for more wisdom. And it's more the idea of wisdom in order to stay close to God and rule the people. And so he'll ask for wisdom. The fourth challenge in chapters 5 to 8, the fourth challenge is how do you build, you're going to build a temple, how do you get the resources to build something? He's never conducted a building campaign before. And so his way is going to be through heavy taxation, and then there's going to be a conscription process where he will, instead of a military draft, we're going to have a work draft. We're going to draft people to work on the temple. Whether they want to or not, they're going to be drafted to work on the temple. And we're also going to raise taxes, and we're going to get all of this fabulous wealth to build this fabulous Solomonic temple. And then, that's his challenge. The outcome, he gets it. He gets the temple that he wanted to build. His father had the desire to build it, was not qualified to do so by God's directives. But Solomon will build that magnificent temple. But in the process, he is going to alienate the people that he conscripted and the people that he heavily taxed. So much so that when Solomon does die, and his son Rehoboam is about to come to the throne, a delegation from the northern tribes will come and say, we'll follow you as the king if you'll just lighten up. And he's going to say no. In fact, he gets really graphic, but we'll get to that. Take Panorama plus 7, and we'll get into how crude the Scripture can be, but very clear. All right. Also, here's another challenge. Number 5, relocating the Ark. In other words, we need to transport the Ark safely from Mount Zion, where it rests, under David's instructions, where the temple or the tabernacle is located, to the Temple Mount. And it's not very far away. It's, in fact, Mount Zion would be south and west, would be a hill structure south and west of the Temple Mount, where today we see the Dome of the Rock. It was over there, probably the upper room was located. So it's really quite close. But the Ark needs to be moved to the completed temple and placed into the Holy of Holies. That's where it belongs. Now, if you'll recall a little bit of history of the Ark of the Covenant, it was a piece of furniture. It was a holy piece of furniture. It was a chest. The lid was called the mercy seat. There were 2 cherubim statues or figures that their wings covered the mercy seat. It's the mercy seat where the blood was sprinkled on the Day of Atonement. And inside of it, there was a copy of the 10 Commandments. Supposedly, writer of Hebrews tells us, Aaron's rod that budded, and also at one time there was a pot of manna in there. But manna didn't have a real long staying power, so it may have been a pot with some ashes in it or whatever. But at any rate, it was a very important piece of furniture in the tabernacle and then later into the temple. It was captured by the Philistines because the Israelites were beginning to see the Ark almost like a magic wand. If we took it into battle, we would always win. Well, it was never intended for that purpose. That's where Spielberg went wrong. He kind of thought there was something special about the Ark itself. The Ark was the symbol of God's presence and God's power with his people. So when the Ark was captured by the Philistines, they placed it before their god, Dagon. Dagon fell down and broke up, and so they got afraid, and they sent it on out and sent it back to the Israelites. It spent a short period of time at a place called Beit Shemesh, the house of Shemesh. It was there a few months. Then it was taken to Kiriath Jearim, where it stayed for about 20 years. In David's first attempt to take it from Kiriath Jearim to Jerusalem, one of the men, Uzzah, reached up and touched the Ark when it tottered, and he died instantly. These guys should have gone back and read the Mosaic legislation that you carry the Ark with poles. You don't transport it by a cart. And that there were specific instructions, and they are treating this holy piece of furniture in a very casual sort of way. And so when that happened, they left it at the home of Obed-Edom, who was a Gittite, and it stayed there for a while. And then on David's second attempt, he got it to Mount Zion, placed it there at the tent of meeting. And then now Solomon will have the task of that short movement of taking it from Mount Zion and putting it in the temple. All right? That's more than you wanted, but we aim to give you all the full load here. Number 6, here's another challenge, and that is, as a king, to walk in integrity before the Lord. That is a challenge for all leaders, religious and otherwise, is to walk. Character really does matter, as we know, because we live in a time when we have leadership, and you just really wonder about the integrity of the people who are trying to lead. So, without trying to get into politics, walk in integrity as Israel's king was a great challenge. That's going to require, the issue then is, will he embrace covenant loyalty, faithfulness? Will he be loyal to the covenant that God has given? And the outcome is he will not. He will fail in his covenant loyalty. And then 7, I put the 7th one in there. I just think the challenge was to maintain his heart for God. And because of pride and trying to mix religions, he failed, and he shared his heart for God and followed other gods as well. He never denied Yahweh. He just wanted to welcome the other gods of his wives in as well. And the text tells us that he worshiped those other gods, which the biblical text says, to no surprise, and the Lord became very angry. Yeah, okay. So that's a sense. These are the challenges that are facing him. Let's get back, let's get to the story. Let's look at Solomon's life. First of all, the succession to the throne. There's only been one transition before Solomon. That was between Saul and David. It did go really, really well. The next question is, who is our next king? And 1 Kings chapter 1, verse 1, David was very old. He could not keep warm. That's probably a factor of his age and perhaps illness. It's an indicator that he's nearing the end of his life and having physical problems. So the tenant said, let's look for a young virgin to serve the king and to take care of him. Literally, the Hebrew says to stand before him. The idea is that he needs a live-in nurse. This is not to fulfill any sexual needs that the aged king might have or anything like that. I doubt if he has any at all at this point. He's really towards the end of his life. But it is someone that would be a live-in nurse or an attendant or a servant, if you will. Her name is Abishag, a Shunammite, and she is described in verse 4 as beautiful, very beautiful. And number 2, she took care of the king. She served him, waited on him, and then there were no sexual relations. Now, why is this important to us? Well, hold on, because she's going to be at the center of a controversy later on. So we just want to remember Abishag's name and that she has been placed in the court in order to take care of David. We make several comments about that, but look at point B, ambition of Adonijah, chapter 1, verse 5. Adonijah was David's 4th son, and he's the eldest living son. He's the one who naturally would expect to be the next king. But the Lord has not chosen him. You know, God does that a lot of times. You know, look at Esau and Jacob. Esau technically was the eldest, but Jacob was the one chosen by God. And that happens quite a number of times. And so, as we look at the bottom of the page, 1 Kings 1, verse 5, now Adonijah, whose mother was Haggith, put himself forward, or New American Standard says, he exalted himself and said, I will be king. I mean, the word is out. The king is ill. It's time to, it's time to have an accession to the kingship. And to Adonijah, it seemed, this is my time. So I'm going to make my claim and announce my intentions. I will be king. So we got chariots and horses ready with 50 men to run ahead of him. That's things kings would do when they would be traveling through the city. And verse 6, his father had never rebuked him. A little bit of biblical data to say is that David is an overly indulgent father. And you say, really? Are we sure about that? Think Absalom. Here's the son who tried to take the throne away from him, away from King David, and who's basically would rather kill David, become king, and yet when Absalom dies, David is an emotional wreck. And he's weeping and crying, oh, Absalom, and all that. I mean, one of his generals has to say, buck up. Your men out here have given their lives for you, and now you're acting in an unbecoming sort of way. Well, he's an indulgent father, unfortunately. So, the text tells us that he, Adonijah, was also very handsome and was born next after Absalom, the dead son who tried to usurp the throne. Let's turn the page. Joining Adonijah in this bold declaration, we have Joab. And Joab is is the former commander of David's armies. But Joab is a bit out of favor. Not a bit, he is out of favor. He faithfully served David for many years and was very, very beneficial as a general under David. But he had killed Abner, and he had also killed, I can't remember the other person's name, but he had taken some things into his own hands and murdered some people, and that did not go well with King David. And so he's sort of out of favor, if you will. Abiathar was a very influential priest, but he was replaced by Zadok. And so you've got these two very important, well-known figures lining up now behind Adonijah. Now, not all influential leaders are lining up. Zadok, the priest, is not in favor of this. Benaiah, one of David's mighty men, is not behind this. Nathan the prophet is not behind this. And no surprise to anyone, Bathsheba, the mother of Solomon, is not behind this. And she has a favored position with the king. So Nathan hatches a plot, and he tells Bathsheba, here's what we're going to do. First thing we're going to do is we're going to let you go in and in a very tactful sort of way ask the king, did you appoint Adonijah as the next king? I will come in later and I'll say the same thing. He sort of does it. He's going to use a series of questions, but he's going to get around to the same idea. Middle of the page, 1 Kings 1, verse 17. She said to him, King David, the ailing King David, she said, my lord, you yourself swore to me, your servant, by the Lord your God, Solomon your son shall be king after me, and he will sit on my throne. But now Adonijah has become king, and you, my lord the king, you didn't know anything about it. Then while she's still speaking, in comes Nathan. And Nathan arrives, and the king was told Nathan was here, and king had him come in, and verse 24, Nathan said, well, actually he's asking some questions, kind of rhetorical questions. He says to the king, have you, my lord the king, declared that Adonijah shall be king after you, and that he will sit on your throne? Skipping down to verse 27. Is this something my lord David, the king, has done without letting his servants know who should sit on the throne of my lord, the king? David, did you do this? Well, David says no, in effect. And so even though he's ill, probably rarely even goes to his court for kingly kind of functions. At the top of the next page, page 116, King David said, call in Bathsheba. So she came into his presence. The king took an oath in verse 29. And here is a binding oath of the king. And basically it says this, Solomon will be the next king. This is a kingly binding oath to the queen, one of his queens, I guess, Bathsheba. His directives to others, 1 Kings 1:32. King David said, call in Zadok and Nathan and Benaiah. Now, these were the influential people who had not followed the lead of Adonijah. He said, take your Lord's servants with you and have Solomon my son mount my own mule and take him down to Gihon. Now, Gihon was, if you know anything about Israel, if you're ever on a map, think of a pitchfork. And as you look at your pitchfork, the left finger would be the Hinnom Valley, the right finger would be the Kidron Valley, and the middle one we call the central or Tyropean. And the temple was between the Central Valley and the Kidron. At the southern portion of the Kidron, right where the fork of a pitchfork is, at the bottom of it, there was a spring called Gihon Spring. So that's a location right where this is going to happen. So get my mule, my kingly mule, take him down to Gihon. Have Zadok and Nathan anoint him king. This is now being done as an official, public sort of thing. Blow the trumpet, shout, long live King Solomon. He's going to sit on my throne. And so this is going to be his coronation ceremony. Now, Adonijah, at the same time, not far away, is having his own little coronation banquet. And a messenger arrives and says, they're having a coronation ceremony back in Jerusalem at Gihon. And when they heard about that, look at the bullet points at the bottom of 116. Here's what the messenger said. King David has made Solomon king. Nathan the prophet has anointed him as king. Royal officials have acknowledged him as king. And David has said, praise be to the Lord, the God of Israel, who has allowed my eyes to see my successor on my throne today. And that broke up Adonijah's party. And not, if you were an invited guest thinking, I want to go to this banquet, I want to get next to the seat of power, this is going to be the next king, I want to get there to where I can get some perks, and maybe some appointments and some special kinds of requests that I might ask in the future. Suddenly, all of the guests scatter. And when the dust settles, it's just Adonijah and Joab and the former high priest. Top of the next page, 1 Kings chapter 1, verse 49. At this, all Adonijah's guests rose in alarm and dispersed. And so what is Adonijah going to do? This is treasonous, what he has done. What do you think the penalty for treason is? Yeah. So what does he do? He runs to the temple and he grabs the horns of the altar. And that's just on the outside at the altar. And in doing so, he is invoking protection, legislative protection, described in, where is it described? Leviticus, I think. And it basically allows time for everyone to cool down and the administrative process to go through. But it's his hope that this is going to spare my life. This is my only recourse. And so what's Solomon going to do? Some would think Solomon would drag him out of the area, of the courtyard area, and drag him out and execute him. That's what many kings of that day would have done. Verse 52 says, Solomon replied, if he shows himself to be worthy, not a hair of his head will fall to the ground. Now this is a conditional, if then. If he shows himself worthy. But if evil, which would be a further attempt to usurp the throne, keep that in mind. If he tries again, he will die. Then King Solomon sent men, they brought him down from the altar. Adonijah came, bowed to the king, and Solomon said, go to your home. We now have a new king. Here's David's charge in chapter 2, verse 2. Here's his charge to the new king. I'm about to go the way of all the earth. In other words, I'm about to die. And so if I die, here are my final instructions. By the way, Moses did this. Joshua did this. Even Samuel the prophet did this. Same kind of gather some people together. Hey, here are my final words, my final instructions. So here is David's words to his son Solomon, the new king. Here's what he's telling him to do. So, number one, be strong. You might recall what Moses said to Joshua. Be strong and courageous. In fact, he said it to him several times. Then the people told Joshua the same thing. Be strong and courageous. You go back to Joshua, you'll read that story. Number two, act like a man. I've always thought that was interesting. I think today we would say, be strong and man up. In other words, be all that the people would expect, be all that you should be, act like a man. 3, and this is most important, observe what the Lord your God requires. So be strong, man up, and be obedient. Walk in obedience to God. Keep his decrees and commands, his laws and regulations. Do this, obedience, do this so that you may prosper in all you do. Deuteronomy 28-30. Moses made it very clear. When you come into the promised land, If you obey, God will bless. If you disobey, God will curse or discipline. So, King David is telling, former King David is telling new King Solomon, do this so that you can prosper. At the end of verse 4, it says, if your descendants watch how they live, if they walk faithfully, then you'll never fail to have a successor on the throne of Israel. We are establishing a Davidic dynasty according to 2 Samuel 7 Davidic Covenant stipulations. And he's saying, if you walk closely and obey God, that dynasty will be strong. And it may produce, sooner rather than later, may produce the one who will have the kingdom forever. Well, of course, they're not going to do that. That is not going to be the story of the Davidic dynasty until, after a long period of time, suddenly one appears from an obscure beginning, from a little town around Nazareth. He shows up, starts preaching, and he has all of the Davidic qualifications, and he begins to present himself by his works and by his words as the promised Messiah King, who will be, unfortunately, rejected in the triumphal entry. After the triumphal entry, he will be rejected. He'll be hailed as king, but then later rejected. Crucify him, crucify him. We have no king but Caesar. And so consequently, he's saying, if Solomon, if you will be obedient, God will firmly establish our dynasty. So, I have it summarized in points 1, 2, 3. At the bottom, David's death is described, 1 Kings 2:11. He reigned 40 years over Israel. Saul reigned about 40 years, David about 40 years, Solomon will reign about 40 years. So, round numbers, they're plus or minus a little bit. 7 years in Hebron, with the kingdom really kind of split between the followers of Saul as well, and David always had the south. He always had the southern portion. The tribal area of Judah was his. But finally, the final 33 years of David's rule, he was the king over both north and south. So there's good epitaph. Now, on the top of the next page, we have the establishment of Solomon's throne, and Adonijah has not gone away. He has reluctantly accepted and bowed before the king, but he's not rid himself of kingly ambitions. Adonijah kind of quietly approaches the queen mother, Bathsheba, and he has a suspicious ulterior motive request of the queen mother. 1 Kings 2, verse 15. He says, as you know, Bathsheba, as you know, he said, and right there, I would say, in context, the Robert Cup translation is not said, it's whined. As you know, the kingdom was mine, and all Israel looked to me as king. But things changed, and the kingdom's gone to my brother, for it has come to him from the Lord. That's a politically correct thing to say. I don't think he really feels it, but that's politically correct. Verse 16, now I have one request to make of you. Do not refuse me, please. You may make it, she said. Please ask King Solomon. He'll not refuse you, his mother, to give me who? Do we remember this name? Abishag, the attendant to King David, the beautiful virgin lady that was to make him warm and attend to his needs and all of that. Give me Abishag as my wife. Now, on the surface, that sounds, well, yeah, she's described as beautiful. She's unmarried and so forth. But you have to understand the culture of the day. To sleep with or marry a concubine of a sitting king is tantamount to laying claim to the kingship yourself. So what he's basically doing is he's trying to create an issue that can lead to him taking the kingship by sleeping with Abishag, who was a part of David's harem, so to speak. So give me Abishag. And Bathsheba apparently is clueless. She says, very well, I'll speak to the king for you. Well, look at the bottom of the page. 1 Kings, it should say chapter 2,
verse 22 to 25. The chapter is dropped out. But in verse 22, King Solomon answered his mother after she shared all of this, "Why do you request Abishag? You might as well request the kingdom. After all, he's my older brother. Yes, for him. And Abiathar the priest and Joab the son of Zeruiah." Then King Solomon swore by the Lord, "May God deal with me, be it ever so severely, if Adonijah does not pay with his life for this request." Did David misunderstand what he was asking for? No, not at all. And he's already given him one chance at the horns of the altar. He said, go and do no more evil. Well, from David's point of view, this is evil. This is insurrection. Turn the page. So what happened? I have a 1, 2, 3, 4. You'll see at the top of page 119. Adonijah was executed. Joab, the general, was executed. Shimei, who was also one of the treasonous traitors, he was spared, but he was placed under house arrest. In fact, so that Solomon could keep an eye on him. And I do mean house arrest. Solomon was very clear. You leave your home, you forfeit your life. And later he did that. He went out looking for property, and Solomon found out about it. And Solomon apparently is a man of his word. He told him that's what he'd do, and that's in fact what he did. So the biblical observation, 1 Kings 2:46b, the kingdom was now established in Solomon's hands. There are no pretenders to the throne. Solomon's on top. So now we begin a section, point 3, the rise of Solomon's throne. And we come in chapter 3 to something we're all very, very familiar, and that is Solomon's request for wisdom. Now, at the very beginning, in the first 2 chapters of 1 Kings, we see how Solomon gained the throne and took away the pretenders to the throne. Chapters 3 and 4, we're going to see how Solomon will rise to greatness, and it's because he will ask for wisdom to rule the kingdom. Now, he'll get general wisdom as well, but the wisdom that he's talking about is the wisdom to rule this kingdom. So, Solomon's request, he had made an alliance with Egypt, took Pharaoh's daughter as his wife. That was very common in those days. That's how he built his incredibly large harem. But not every woman that was in his harem was the daughter of some chieftain or daughter of some king. Solomon just had large appetites, shall I just say. So apparently he's got a large harem. But at the outset, he makes this alliance. Now, that's not a good start in your kingship. So now we're seeing maybe some cracks in the kingship. He should never have done, at least theological cracks. I don't think God would have been pleased with that. Additionally, the people of Israel were sacrificing at high places. Now, they're not saying they're sacrificing to Moloch or other gods. They're trying to sacrifice to the Lord God. But the Levitical law, remember, you observe the commandments and statutes. Levitical law was you worship wherever the tabernacle is, the centerpiece. That's where the worship was supposed to be. And so since they don't have a temple and they are not going to the tabernacle, people are just picking high places. High places because they thought that was closer to heaven and that was the place where God would be more likely to hear and respond to their worship. So Solomon already is showing his tainted devotion because he is going to sacrifice along with them in the high places. Wisdom needed at the bottom. The Lord appeared the first time to Solomon and asked him what he wanted. Now, Lord my God, you have made your servant king in place of my father David, but I'm only a little child. In other words, I'm an immature person. I'm not fully equipped for the task. I do not know how to carry out my duties. I need wisdom and knowledge how to be a king, how to rule. Your servant is here among the people you've chosen, a great people. Verse 9, so give your servant a discerning heart. That Hebrew word there is related to a word which means to hear. a discerning heart, a hearing heart. What is a hearing heart? Do you remember when Jesus would say, he who has ears to hear, let him hear? What do you say? He who has the ability to understand, to hear something and understand what it means. So what is Solomon saying? I need a hearing heart, a discerning heart. I need to know what to do. I need to know how to apply this knowledge in both my ruling duties, but also in my own life. So give your servant a discerning heart to govern your people and to distinguish between right and wrong. So ultimately what Solomon is asking for is this. He says, I want an obedient soul and I want judicial insight or leadership insight in order to rule well. And so, point 2, the top of 120, 1 Kings 3:10, the Lord was pleased that Solomon asked for that. Verse 12, he said, and notice the I wills here. I will do what you ask. I will give you a wise and discerning heart. Verse 13, moreover, I will give you what you have not asked for. You didn't ask for wealth and honor, but I'm going to give it to you anyway. So that in your lifetime, you'll have no equal among kings. Verse 14, and if, conditional statement, okay, if you walk in obedience to me, keep my decrees, keep the Mosaic legislation, as David your father did, generally did, then I will give you a long life. If you walk in obedience, then I'll give you a long life. Solomon wakes up, realized he had had a vision from God, and so forth. I have a little insight on the bottom of that. I'll let you read that at a future time because we're definitely going to be out of time. Top of the next page, we're talking about the rise of Solomon to the throne, his request for wisdom. And we're just a reminder that it's demonstrated in a very strange story. You've heard the story all your life if you've been raised in the church or you've seen it on I don't know if you see it on a flannelgraph, but nonetheless, you have two prostitutes or two ladies with children, and one of them dies, and so the one who lost their child grabbed the other one's child, and then there was a dispute over whose child is whose. One has died, and they're fighting over their surviving child. And Solomon, who we have now been told has been given a discerning heart, an ability to use wisdom and discernment and so forth. Solomon says, yes, here's my decree. Cut the baby in half to each woman. Well, the woman who lost her child was so calloused, she said, that's fine with me. But the other woman said, no, don't you dare take the child's life. Give it to the other woman. And then Solomon says, okay, now I know who's the real mother. And so it's just, all this is a biblical example of the wisdom, the discerning heart of that. 1 Kings 3:28, the upshot of this is, when all Israel heard the verdict, they held the king in awe because they saw he had wisdom from God to administer justice. So it's a strange illustration of it, but nonetheless, it illustrated that he has received wisdom and he is exercising it in a discerning way. Chapter 4 is about Solomon's administration. It demonstrates the wisdom put into practice as a monarch or as a king. Saul and David, their reigns have been characterized by warfare and expansion of the kingdom. Solomon, he's going to be much more of an administrative politician in a lot of ways. And he's going to expand the kingdom, but he's going to do it with some fighting, but primarily he's going to do it through treaties and other things. So one of the things he'll do is he'll appoint or create 12 districts, and he'll have district governors. In fact, you might put a note out in the margin, see page 7, because I gave you a map with those 7 districts in the early pages of this manual. We don't have to go there now, but just know that he is wisely administering his nation, and he's got these 12 districts. Now, these district governors are responsible for conscription and taxation, and so it's a pretty smart thing. Is they've got to send money back to the central place, So he's got his own system going there. We have. At the bottom of the page, we have a section on the glory of Solomon's reign. on the top of page 122, the daily provisions. When you read about how much food it took to feed Solomon's court, you got a sense of how many of the administrative bureaucracy, but how widespread that it was. We also see that while Solomon is increasing in his wisdom, it's not a narrow wisdom of wisdom to just simply rule well, which that's the primary thrust, but he's wise in many things. 1 Kings 4:29 and 32 to 34. 29 says, God gave Solomon wisdom and very great insight, and a breadth of understanding as measureless as the sand on the seashore. Verse 32, he spoke 3,000 proverbs. Well, we have a collection, a representative collection we'll look at next week. But 3,000 proverbs. He wrote 1,005 songs. Now, what do we call songs in Hebrew in the Old Testament? Psalms. So he wrote 1,005 psalms. He only got, what did he get, 2 in? I think he got 2 in of the collection of 150. So David was a much better writer, I guess, of songs. But nonetheless, verse 33, he had encyclopedic knowledge about plant life and animals and birds and all that. And people came from all around to hear his wisdom and his knowledge. Now, beginning with the bottom of page 122, chapter 5 through 8, we have the temple and the palace. And we kind of know the story, but if you'll turn to page 123, at the top of page 2, or top of the page, point 2, the temple construction, here are the major features of the first permanent temple. The dimensions, 90 feet by 30 feet. So it's actually 30 feet wide. It's 90 feet in depth, and then its height is 45 feet. So you're looking at a 4 to 5 story building. The width of it is really not that big. And then it goes back because if you'll remember the tabernacle, there's the Holy of Holies, the holy place, and then you had the outer courtyard. Well, here you got those 2 places, and then you'll have a magnificent courtyard as well. King Herod will take that basic design and make it bigger. The courtyard will get bigger. What we call the Temple Mount today is much larger than it was in the days of King Solomon, but it was a magnificent structure. Notice point C, its appearance, limestone, cedar, and gold. It was impressive and it was beautiful. It took 7 years to build. Herod, when he will rebuild the second temple, the one they did when Ezra and Nehemiah and all those came back and rebuilt it after this temple was destroyed in 586, Herod started a project that went beyond his lifetime. Almost, 60-something years they worked on getting the Temple Mount and those big Herodian stones that are the foundation of it, and the beauty of the temple. He just magnified it, made it incredibly beautiful, and when they finally finished it, it lasted about 4 years, and it was destroyed by the Romans, and which kind of is what Jesus said was going to happen anyway. When his disciples said, Lord, what about this magnificent temple? And Jesus said, not one stone will be left on another. And so, nonetheless, this is the Solomon temple. Now, point 3 in the middle of the page. He also constructed a palace. Look at the dimensions. 150 feet by 75 feet and 40 feet high. A good bit larger. The functions of the palace, it was a throne hall, a hall of justice where judging occurred, palace living quarters, separate palace for the Pharaoh's daughter, or Solomon's, one of his wives, probably one of his more prominent wives, and so forth. And so I would just simply ask you a rhetorical question. Compared to the temple, what observations do you have on his palace? And does that give us any indication of what's most important to him? The text doesn't tell me that. It's just, I can't help but noticing that sort of thing. We have the temple furnishings in chapter 7. When we go to the next page, at the top, page 5, or point 5, the temple and the ark, we remember that the Israelites are a covenantal people. They are in covenant with God. That's like a contractual arrangement with God. And it's built on the fact that, one, God had redeemed them out of bondage to Egypt. Two, He'd constituted them as a nation. All this is narrated for us in Exodus 19. And then He had also provided the law as their constitution and as their ethic for life. So they were a religious political group, and their constitution involved their civil laws, it involved their worship laws, it involved all of those kinds of things. And so the ark was supposed to be placed in the Holy of Holies. And in the notes there, I have 2 bullet points that 2 features of Israel's relationship with their God are particularly noteworthy. And one is that the temple is God's place, His house, where He can reside with His people. His presence can be with His people. And His presence was in the tabernacle. His presence will now be in the temple. As a matter of fact, later, when they have the coronation and they dedicate the temple, the Shekinah glory falls in such power that the priests can't even go into the temple structure to do their duties. It's so thick. And so consequently, God is demonstrating His pleasure with, let's think of the temple this way, as the permanent tabernacle, because that's what it is. It's now, we've got a permanent tabernacle, but it's a temple instead. So we see on the next page the dedication, and I'd like for you to notice on page 125, under point 6, there's Solomon's prayer to God, and it's worth going back and reading. He just really does a nice job with his prayer. In fact, jumping down, I don't know where it is, verse 23, Lord, the God of Israel, there's no God like you in heaven above or on earth below. You who keep your covenant of love with your servants, who continue wholeheartedly in your way, you kept your promise, and so forth. Just a magnificent prayer. 1 Kings 8, may your eyes be open to your servant's plea, to the plea of your people. You singled us out as a special treasured nation for you, chosen people, and so forth. And then he addresses the people in verse 54 to 61. And look at verse 57 at the very bottom of the page. And notice the may. This is his petition or request. Lord, may this happen. May the Lord be with us. Turn the page. Verse 58. May he turn our hearts to him. In other words, God, help us walk with you. Verse 59. May these words of mine, which I've prayed, be near to the Lord our God. Verse 61. May your hearts, people, be fully committed to the Lord. So you've got in this dedication, Solomon's going to pray to God. He's going to also speak to the people. And they're going to make sacrifices and all of those kinds of things. And then God will show his favor. But it doesn't, we're at a high point. But we're not going to stay there long. Look at the bottom of the page, 126, the descent. For 20 years, Solomon had been building the temple and his royal palace. And he's got a large empire to run with 12 districts. His reigns, he's about halfway through his reign, year 24 of 40 years. Notable achievements, notable accomplishments. But here's the greater question. Will he finish strong with an undivided heart? And the answer is no, he will not. So, in chapter 9, top of the next page, the Lord appeared once again to Solomon. This is his second appearance to him. It's a Davidic Covenant renewal. I'll let you read that. It's in 1 Kings 9, 4-9. There's a lot of, if you'll do this, then I'll do this. But it's basically calling Solomon to fidelity to the Davidic Covenant, and that God will be faithful to what he promised in the Davidic Covenant. We have his accomplishments, a series of accomplishments in towards the bottom of the page. I just bullet pointed those. If you want to read the actual text, you can do so on your own. And then the Queen of Sheba is going to arrive.
We've always heard of this story. His fame has reached to her. Now, to be fair, she's not sitting in her palace saying, I really want to talk to a guy who knows a lot. His fame has come to her, but she's really more interested in possibly spice treaties where they can be economic partners. But she's also heard what an incredible person, what a knowledgeable person he is. So the Queen of Sheba decides not to just send envoys. She's going to go herself. And so she does. And on page 128, at the top, 1 Kings 10, verse 3, Solomon answered all her questions. Nothing was too hard for the king to explain to her. And when the queen saw all the wisdom of Solomon and the palace he had built, the food and the the incredible banquet and all that, verse 6, she said to the king, the report I heard in my own country about your achievements and your wisdom is true. But I did not believe these things until I came and saw with my own eyes. Indeed, not even half was told me. In wisdom and wealth you have exceeded the report that I heard. Well, again, that's in that wisdom motif, that Solomon is known as a great wise person. All right, he prospers. That's in chapter 10, verse 14 to 29. He's going to become fabulously wealthy. God was pleased when he asked for wisdom, said, I'll give you the wealth and honor as well. And Solomon is incredibly wealthy for his days. As we turn to page 129, I have a big insight, big box there. We have to recall that Moses had said, when you come into the land and you set up a king, you better make sure that your king doesn't multiply horses for warfare, and that he doesn't multiply wives and make treaties and not trust me, trust the treaty, but not trust me. That's a big issue in the book of Isaiah, by the way. And make sure that he does not unduly accumulate more wealth than I will naturally give him. And Moses was very clear on that. So note carefully 5 points. Solomon was qualified to be king. He's a son of David, a son of Abraham. Solomon's reign, however, looked very much like the kingdoms around him. And you might remember the original request made to Samuel, the prophet, was, we want a king like all the other nations have a king. Well, you got it. Number 3, he acquired horses and chariots. He trusted in his military might. He accumulated great wealth. He taxed heavily his people, so he increased his wealth beyond even what God said, I would give you. And he did acquire many wives. And as a result of those many wives, the text tells us his heart was turned away from the Lord. So Solomon failed as a king. He did some really wonderful things, but the overall kingship is marked by his failure, his heart failure, to not be solely and wholly dedicated to the Lord. I have 4 tragic events in his life. You'll have to read those for yourself as we're out of time. But those tragic events deal with much of what we've already said, ignoring Moses' advice about multiple wives and multiplying horses and all of that. The text says that the Lord became angry with that. You have to jump all the way over to page 132. There were rebellions that rose up against Solomon he had to put down. There was the rebellion of Jeroboam, who was a very naturally gifted leader, recognized in the north. He even came into Solomon's court and performed admirably, but apparently was very, very ambitious, and he went a little too far, and Solomon went after him, and so he had to hightail it to Egypt, and he stays down in Egypt until he hears that Solomon dies, and then he comes back, and he leads the northern delegation that will come and say, we'll serve you as king, only lighten the load a little bit. And he's going to be the leader of that. But a prophet has already told him that the kingdom's going to split and you're going to have the northern kingdom. That's been prophesied to him. So you've got that issue coming as well. So you have the rebellion of Jeroboam. That's the point 3. And then if you'll highlight, put a star next to it,
But Solomon's life summarized at the bottom of 133. I quote a man by the name of Gary Enrig, and it's on this page and the next page, and it's a fabulous summary of the life of King David. You must go back and read. It's just so well written. Beneath it is a nice little summarization chart of Solomon's life in 4 phases. And then, of course, we have the takeaways. You can read those for yourself as well. That's a lot of material. That's a lot. We move fast, particularly at the end. But I'm hoping that if you have time and interest, go back and slowly read back through the biblical text or the workbook, the manual, and the biblical text embedded within it, and just get a good feel for the life of King Solomon. 3 kings, and yet the issue always boiled down to Proverbs 4. Above all else, guard your heart, for it is the wellspring of life. And that example comes across the centuries, like Paul would say from 1 Corinthians 10. That example comes to us today. And my parting word to you is, guard your heart. Lord, bless us. Bless us, we ask, with an increased hunger for you and a hunger for your word. For we ask it in Christ's name. Amen. Amen. Thanks, everyone.